Hey there, scabby scummers and gangers. Crimson Oracle here with another of my Battlefield on a Budget terrain videos where we're going to be looking at how I used some plastic moldings that were from various packages and made them into some scatter terrain that I think will really enhance the board that I've been working on. So I'm excited to show these off. And this one is interesting because I used a bit of a technique that is a little bit more complicated. And actually, the way I did it is probably not technically the best way to do it. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But I am really happy to be regularly getting these videos out. I love making terrain. And this terrain project has been really fun because I'm trying to make terrain that I can leave at one of the local game stores that I've been playing at a lot, which does not actually stock terrain because they're not like a tabletop gaming kind of store. It's more like Magic the Gathering and role playing and board games and stuff. So making them terrain that we can leave there and play on will be a nice step to making it easier for folks to get a game in. So with that, enjoy. I will be walking you through the process by which I made some scatter terrain from trash. So right out of the gates, we're starting with this plastic packaging. One came from a bird feeder that I got for the budgie that flew into my life recently. And the other was from a pack of mushrooms that came in a meal kit, I think. And we're using the cardboard technique I showed off a few videos ago. I'm using that to base pretty much all of this terrain. I actually prefer plastic card for basing, but the whole point of this video is to do this as cheap as possible. And while I can get plastic card cheap, cardboard is free. Now, this is the bit where I said that things get a little bit more advanced. So I am using a photo resin that is UV cured to harden the inside of this object. I do this because if you leave them alone and you just start working on them without doing something to harden the interior, these very thin plastics, unlike the other piece, they are really pretty flexible. They can wind up flexing and chipping your paint off, and that is no fun when you're generally going to store this kind of terrain in a bin. That's not what you want. So the reason I said earlier that this is probably not exactly the best way to do this is that I am using a photo cured resin, which is kind of a slow process. I had to cure it with this light, and then you won't see off screen that I wind up putting it in my curing box that I use for 3D prints, and wound up also washing it and then curing it again because photo resins are pretty particular about curing properly. You could do this with a 2-part epoxy resin that you get at the craft store, and it will go significantly faster because you don't have to do anything to cure the resin. You just mix the 2 parts and it cures on its own. The only thing to watch out for is to use a very thin layer of resin. If you use too much resin, the resin is curing is an exothermic reaction, which means that it releases heat. The heat that comes out of it is often enough to burn your hand or, importantly, melt your very thin, fragile plastic that you're trying to reinforce, which is the exact opposite of what we want. We're not trying to melt our new project. So as a result, I recommend using a very thin layer of resin. Use a small amount. The nice thing about resins is that you can kind of mix the exact amount you need. And if you need to fill in more to strengthen it more, you can do that because they stick to each other. So that's how this technique works. It's a little bit more advanced than a lot of the other stuff that we're going to be doing in here. And by that, I just mean that resins are nasty stuff. You have to make sure you wear gloves. You have to make sure that you wear eye protection. Don't spill, you'll see that I spilled a little bit on my work mat. I wound up curing it and picking it off later. But, you want to make sure that you're working in a surface that you don't mind damaging. Resin is a tricky material. And if you want to avoid it altogether, then I just recommend using some thicker, heavier plastics. But I love the shape of this part so much that even though it's not a part I would usually use, I wanted to. All right, so now we're gonna actually glue the cardboard down. I'm using accelerant again because I finally got some more. Now you'll notice that I'm making sure not to cut towards my fingers with this blade. It's all going pretty quickly, so it's hard to see the details, but I always cut away from myself. It's really important to be careful when you're working with such a sharp blade. I have cut myself many, many times, and I regret it every time. And now, of course, we use glue and accelerant to get the piece attached to the cardboard. And this will be a nice solid bit because of all of that extra weight. Then I bring in the wood filler and slap it down. The wood filler will harden, it will make the paper more rigid, and it will add a bunch of weight. And what I really like about this terrain is that it's nice and hefty. You don't have the kind of problem of when you build something out of plastic art and it weighs almost nothing and you can get kind of blown around the table. This stuff is hefty. Wood filler is not light. And while that dries, oh yeah, I've come in and do the detailing here. I use a lot of bits of cardboard from a cereal box and various plastic things. There's little side bits are plastic that I took from last video. I used the lid of a push pop. And so in this one, I used a bit of plastic from a push pop that I cut off from the previous video. I try to save every little bit. All right, now here I come in and do rivets. Again, I'm using the half circle nail beads that I got on Amazon for almost nothing. And I'm coming through with glue, a little dot of glue, and then you take a knife and you stick it into the rivet and you place it down on the piece. It's a slow process, but I find that the extra detail adding rivets adds is generally worth it for terrain, at least for some pieces. You know, you don't have to put the same level of detail into every single piece. It's okay to kind of have a mixture of different levels of quality in your terrain. People, generally speaking, won't mind, and they'll be more drawn to the stuff that you put the most effort into. All right, and now we are working on the other piece while the wood filler dries. So again, gluing it down to the cardboard. This one was nice hard plastic, so it didn't need to be reinforced. And then for this one, I added a top. I find that this is a great way to take those kind of weird shapes that are at the top of these molded packages and make them look, you know, more like a building. Adding that kind of roof and then some struts for support made out of a little bit of a wooden dowel. And then a little bit of a cardboard there to form kind of a barricade. I like to add barricades to some of it and not all. That way there's a risk of falling, which is a major thing in Necromunda, not so much in bigger war games. And as you can see with the paper corrugated sheet, and then I add a bit of popsicle stick there to make the sides of the door kind of blend better with the building. And I add a bit more detail. Ta-da! We come in with the wood filler, work our way around. I like to use the wood filler also to sometimes reinforce spots where, say, cardboard is glued to cardboard, because the cardboard itself, while it takes glue really well, it also will separate from glue pretty easily by just tearing. So if you bring in a little bit of wood filler, it reinforces that connection and you don't have that problem. I also fill in around the door so the door looks like it's part of the building. And now everything has to dry. And I come in with the paste that I use. You can see my other video where I show how I make the paste. Lovely stuff. And this is the midway point. We're going to come in with the same kind of deal here. First, I want to cut the door down a little bit so it looks like it opens outward. And then I'm going to use the same nail beads to add a little bit of detail to the door, make it look like a door. and of course more rivets. And now we do our texture paste once again. This stuff really helps take your terrain up another level. Smooth things out, fills in weird holes. The wood filler, when it dries, it will sometimes leave a little bit of a crack. The glue will help come in there. And then I use an airbrush, but again, this can all be done with a rattle can. I use 2 colors, either black or gray, and then white over top. And that then allows me to use a nice thin paint mixture and have it kind of fill in the shadows. All right, so I'm using craft paint once again, coming in with a nice sloppy coat of I use Flow Improver in order to get a better coverage, and that allows a bit more of the shadows to shine through. Get all of the building parts painted brown. And then I'm going to come in with a white or an off-white and mix it a little bit with the brown and paint the bottoms of the bases. And now we come in with an orange. Once again, craft paint. I try to use craft paint as much as possible. And we slop it on to give it a nice rusty kind of look. And then a little bit of silver. Do the edges in the silver. You don't want the silver to be too prominent, but when rust flakes off, it's metal underneath. And now here I come in with a black wash. Again, this is a wash that I make from ink, water, medium, and Flow Improver. I will do an episode where I talk about making washes eventually. And now I come in with weathering pigment. I start with the European earth, and then I come in with the desert sand. These are Vallejo, but you can really use any kind of pigment as long as it's the right colors for what you're doing. I really like to use the wash and the pigment together to kind of bond the pigment to the surface. And hey, here we are, scatter terrain. Thanks to all of my patrons for supporting me. You guys make this show possible. And of course, if you are interested in supporting the show, you can do so on my Patreon. And if you are interested in Necromunda, I have a podcast with lots and lots and lots of Necromunda content. So go ahead and check that out. And of course, everybody out there, stay safe and don't forget to change your paint water.